The road was nearly deserted that night. A few cars rolled by, their headlights bouncing off the wet pavement. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, after 11. The kind of time most people just wanted to get home. Lieutenant Colonel Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours. Her fingers tapped the wheel, humming to the gentle rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through the speakers. She wasn't wearing a uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied back. Nothing to stand out. Or so she thought. Then she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, rapidly approaching. Her stomach clenched. Not from fear. She knew how these things went. But from exhaustion. She signaled for a lane change and eased the car to the side of the road. She took a slow breath and kept both hands where she could see. She had been in the military long enough to know how to do it. The white patrol car stopped behind her. The officer took his time getting out. When he finally arrived, his posture was one of absolute obedience. His heavy boots scraped the asphalt. One hand was on his belt, the other holding a bright flashlight, shining it into her window. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. The name on his badge caught the light, Briggs. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced to the point of impatience. Renee looked him straight in the mirror. It was the look of a man who had seen hundreds of faces like hers and remembered none of them. To him, she was just another black woman. She slowly reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the paperwork. "Was I speeding, officer?" Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Briggs narrowed his eyes, studying her for a long moment. She saw it in his eyes, the confidence that he had power. He could intimidate. He could trouble. But he didn't know who she was. Little did he know that just a few months later, he would see her again. In a courtroom. And that time, she would be the one to destroy his career. Renee looked straight at Briggs, her voice calm as she asked the question. Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her, holding them out of reach, his eyes still on her car as he scanned them. A moment of silence stretched between them, tense but not quite explosive. "Tail lights out," he said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Briggs finally looked at her. His eyes were sharp, unblinking. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed. The air between them changed, becoming heavy like a wire stretched to its limit. Renee recognized this moment, the moment when authority met resistance. She had seen it before, in briefings, on overseas bases, in training exercises that prepared sailors for the world. She knew better than to push. But she knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice still calm. "My taillights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's anything wrong, I can fix it." She reached for the door handle, ready to step out. But Briggs cut her off before she could do anything else, as if he hadn't heard a word she'd said. Renee exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the line of cars ahead. There were no witnesses. A feeling of unease crept up inside her, but she kept her composure. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel once, then finally opened the door. "Why?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Why did you stop me?" Briggs tilted her head, the corners of her lips curling into a smirk. "Because I said so." The air seemed to freeze for a moment. Renee let his answer hang in the air, letting it reveal its own absurdity. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the car door. The night air was cooler than she expected, carrying a hint of the dampness of the night. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, her stance relaxed but measured. She didn't want to fight, but she also wasn't going to be bullied. Briggs took a step back, assessing her. She could feel his eyes on her, measuring, considering how far he could push her before she fought back. "Get back in the car," he said. This time, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, a sense that if she stepped back into the car, she would lose something important. A part of herself. Briggs took a step forward, the distance between them closing. The smile disappeared from his face. Are you resisting? Renee stood still, her eyes unwavering. I'm asking a question. A light flashed across his face, annoyance, impatience perhaps. She couldn't be sure. But she did know one thing, she was not one to be easily subdued. Renee took a deep breath, trying to steady her heartbeat as Briggs grabbed her radio. We have a non-compliant driver here, he muttered into the speaker, his voice gruff, before turning back to stare at her, his eyes full of authority. Renee didn't blink. Officer, I need you to understand something, she said, her voice low but firm. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do. And I know exactly what you can't do. Briggs gritted his teeth. You're under arrest, he snapped, reaching out to grab her wrist. But she was already a step ahead of him. A slight step back, just enough to avoid being caught. Under arrest for what? She asked, her voice calm but her eyes piercing. Briggs pulled on the handcuffs, his face red. For obstructing an officer. Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. She had hundreds of hours of military training, handling stressful situations, but this was not a battlefield. She had two choices, comply and fight back later, or push back now and risk making things worse. No. She would not become a statistic. Slowly and deliberately, she turned around, placing her hands on the roof of the car, feeling the cool metal under her palms. Briggs didn't miss his chance. He yanked her hands behind her back, locking the handcuffs, too tight. A sharp pain shot up her wrists as the cold metal dug into her flesh. Before she could react, Briggs had shoved her toward the patrol car. You don't know what you're doing, she muttered, trying to contain her anger. Briggs laughed. I know exactly what I'm doing, ma'am. He opened the car door, shoving her into the back seat without bothering to adjust the handcuffs. The hard plastic seat dug into her back, adding to the discomfort. But Renee didn't move, just watched silently through the glass partition between her and the front seat. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Briggs strutted back to his car, muttering something into the radio. Renee looked at her reflection in the glass partition. Her face looked calm, but beneath the mask, a fire was smoldering. She had been through battles, tense interrogations in foreign lands. But this, being bundled into a police car for obstructing an officer, was a whole different battle. And she had no intention of losing. Briggs leaned back in his seat, his hands gripping the wheel lightly, his eyes glancing at the woman in the rearview mirror. Her expression was calm, but he could sense the challenge in her eyes. A heavy silence fell over the patrol car as it sped along under the pale streetlights. Good, he whistled, his voice full of satisfaction. Let's go for a little ride. She didn't answer. Only the faint click of the handcuffs as she tried to move her wrists. They were too tight. He had done it on purpose. She said nothing, just stared out the window, her gaze drifting over the red and blue reflections on the road. They flickered, an invisible reminder of the situation. A few minutes passed. Then 5. Then 10. You know what? Briggs said, breaking the silence. Most people just keep quiet when I tell them to get out of the car. Renee took a deep breath, a breath caught in her chest. And most officers don't arrest people for questioning over a traffic stop. Briggs laughed, shaking her head. Ma'am, you must really think you're someone. She turned her head, her gaze meeting his smug one. I don't think so, I know. A flicker of confusion crossed Briggs's face. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, but he quickly covered it with a faint smile. Military? He asked, his tone changing, tinged with curiosity. She didn't answer. Her silence made Briggs even more uncomfortable. "Yeah, I think so. You have the attitude of someone who's above the law." He smirked, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Bet you think I'd back down if you threw that in my face." She still didn't answer, just closed her eyes for a moment. Briggs clicked his tongue, as if disappointed. "Shame," he muttered. "If you'd just kept quiet, we could have avoided all this." She clenched her jaw, not at his words, but at the way he tried to make it all her fault. A cheap power play. But she wasn't going to play by his rules. Outside the window, the police station came into view. A low, gray brick building in the darkness. The parking lot was mostly empty. No one was there to witness. No one to see this abuse of power. Briggs stopped the car, turned off the engine. He turned to her, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Here we are. Get out." She stared at him, then took a slow breath. The feel of the handcuffs digging into her flesh was a reminder, of power, of control. But also of injustice. And she was not one to be controlled. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance. He killed the engine, looking back at her through the bulkhead. A slow, knowing smile crossed his lips. "I like it when they make it easy," he muttered. Before Renee could react, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him like a full stop. A second later, her side door swung open. "Get out." His voice was even, but it carried an undeniable command. Renee turned her wrists slightly as she stepped out, feeling the handcuffs tighten, burning her skin. He didn't loosen them even a little. She held her head high as Briggs led her inside, past the deserted reception area, where a sergeant sat behind a desk, eyes fixed on a computer screen. No one looked at them. No one cared. Inside the processing area, the smell of stale coffee and sweat hung in the air. A metal chair lined the far wall, cold and impassive. No one else. No noise. Just her and Briggs. He uncuffed her, just long enough to complete the booking, fingerprints, photo, a mindless mechanical process. She had seen this kind of apathy before. It was what allowed people like Briggs to get away with it. When he was done, he grabbed her wrist again, squeezing it harder than necessary. "You think you're so smart," he growled. She glanced to the side, her voice light. "I didn't even think." Briggs's fingers tightened around her wrist, a jolt of pain shooting up her arm. She knew she'd pissed him off, and that was oddly satisfying. "Enjoy your vacation." He sneered, pushing her toward the cell. Renee swayed but caught herself. She turned in time to see the metal bars slide into each other, the lock clicking firmly. Briggs stood there, smiling mockingly, tapping his fingers against the bars before turning and walking away. There was no one else. No other prisoners. Just her. Renee took a deep breath, then sat down on the cold bench. The metal seeped through her jeans, cold and unforgiving. She shifted a little, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness spreading through her body. The cell was empty, just 4 bare walls and a single flickering light on the ceiling. No one would come to her aid. No one would see what was about to happen. Briggs thought that confining her for one night would be enough. Little did he know that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. She had spent nights in far worse conditions. Places where the threat was not mere annoyance but actual danger. This was nothing. But that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmurs of officers, talking at the front desk. The occasional shuffle of papers, the clink of coffee cups on tables. And in the still air of the cell, the smell of old sweat mixed with the faintest of disinfectants, a combination that made her feel stifled, reminiscent of long hours of tense waiting. She exhaled slowly and evenly. Controlled her breathing. Controlled her mind. Basic training had been drilled into her long before she'd even set foot on the fleet. Then heavy footsteps. Briggs. She knew it was him before he appeared. His stride had an arrogant rhythm, like a man who thought he was untouchable. He appeared in front of the cell a second later, his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk on his face. Too comfortable. She didn't answer. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. You know, if you were just playing along, you wouldn't be here right now. She let a slow smile curve the corners of her lips. Oh, I'm right where I need to be. Briggs's smile flickered for just a second. Something flickered in his eyes, discomfort, uncertainty. He covered it quickly, scoffing as he glanced toward the holding area. No one's coming for you tonight, girl. He shrugged. I guess that means you'll have time to think about that attitude. Renee just looked at him, unmoving. Briggs didn't flinch, leaning in a little. Here's the thing. People like you think the rules don't apply. I think a little confidence is enough to get you out of trouble. She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter. Because he didn't know what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway. A young man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a standard uniform. He stopped a few feet away, holding a clipboard. Sergeant? We got a call. Briggs barely glanced at the officer. The young man stood there, hesitating for a moment, seeming to weigh his words before speaking. I think, he shifted on his feet, hesitating for a moment before continuing. I think you need to see this. Briggs frowned, clearly displeased by the hesitation in the officer's voice. He turned back, glancing at Renee once more before leaving. She said nothing, just sat back, listening to the conversation outside, which had quieted down, but still enough for her to catch bits and pieces of it. Something about a lawyer, a call from a superior, questions about why she was being detained. Briggs's voice dropped, sharp and somewhat annoyed. The young officer stammered something in response, but whatever it was, it didn't satisfy Briggs. Then the heavy footsteps came again. Briggs stormed in, jaw clenched, hands balled into fists. The smirk from before was gone. What the hell have you done? He growled, his voice lower but no less dangerous. Renee leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her eyes flicking defiantly over Briggs. I didn't do anything. She tilted her head a little, a faint smile playing on her lips. But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places. Briggs's face darkened. She could see that moment now, the realization that power was slipping from his grasp. He turned on his heel, muttered something, and disappeared down the hall. Renee sighed. It wouldn't be long. The morning light poured through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished stone floor. The air inside was cold, a chill that seeped into your bones if you sat still for too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. No more handcuffs, no more orange jumpsuit, no more cold cell. Just a tailored navy jacket, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. She wasn't alone. Beside her, Carlo Whitman, her attorney, calmly flipped through a stack of papers, barely looking up. A storm was approaching, and this time, Renee wasn't the one caught in it. Briggs was. The woman was methodical. No wasted movements, no idle chatter. Renee liked that heaviness, the feeling of control, of purpose in every action. But that control was being tested now. The wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with more force than usual, a little shuddering. The air in the room was tense at once as people rushed in, as if they were afraid of missing the important moment. Whispers, the crunch of feet on the wooden floor, eyes searching, anxious. No one wanted to take their eyes off the event. Briggs entered. He still carried himself as if he owned the room, shoulders square, chin slightly raised. But this time, there was something different. The stiffness in his gait. Something in his expression. Renee recognized it immediately. It was doubt. Something that had never been there before. She caught his eye, and for just a moment, it met hers. But he looked away, almost instinctively. A small crack in the steady confidence he always displayed. The gavel rang once. All the noise stopped, leaving only heavy anticipation. Judge Alan Kirkland entered. An older man with a tired expression, he adjusted his glasses as he took his seat. He wasted no time. "All right," he sighed, glancing over the case files. "Let's start with the prosecutor." A middle-aged man with neatly combed hair stood up. Cleared his throat. "Your Honor. We have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Colonel Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore," he paused, scanning the crowd before continuing, "new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." The courtroom erupted in a more intense murmur than before. Breaths quickened. Eyes turned to Briggs. Some whispered to each other, some simply stared. Briggs stiffened. He shifted in his chair, clenching his jaw. The knuckles on his clenched hands were white. The judge looked at him over his glasses, his eyes like sharp blades piercing the tense atmosphere. "Sergeant Briggs, would you care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." "Uncooperative?" the prosecutor interrupted, raising his eyebrows suspiciously. He turned, picking up a document from the table. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career. Naval Academy graduate. Many commendations. No criminal record. No notable citations." He paused, letting the question hang in the air, as sharp as a knife about to drop. "You're telling me that, despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her, over a broken taillight?" Briggs opened his mouth. But this time, there was no immediate answer. Only a heavy silence fell over him. The DA continued to flip through his papers, his cold gaze scanning the room. "In addition, there is an internal review of your arrest history." His voice rang out, clear, unwavering. "Indicating a disproportionate number of stops involving black drivers in this county." The whispers grew louder, like an undercurrent. Eyes were exchanged, discontent evident. Briggs's face darkened, a shadow passing over his eyes. Judge Kirkland set the file down with a sigh, his eyes heavy with disappointment. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs sat silently, arms crossed over his chest, shoulders stiff. The air was heavy. Renee could feel the tension in her breath. "Objection." She spoke, but the prosecutor only raised an eyebrow, not bothering to respond. "The body camera footage says otherwise." Another noise rippled through the room, chairs creaking as people shifted. Briggs looked at the judge, suddenly more defensive, his gaze wavering. "I followed standard procedure." Judge Kirkland didn't believe it. He glanced at the bailiff. "Play the footage." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. A blue light flickered, and the video began to play. In the video, a confrontation played out, tense, cold, and filled with unnecessary escalation. Renee didn't turn to look at the screen. She didn't need to watch. She had lived the moment. She remembered her calm voice, Briggs's smug grip on the handcuffs. She remembered the humiliation. The room fell silent as the footage ended. No one said anything. No one needed to say anything. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, clasping his fingers, looking directly at Briggs. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated procedure. You made an unlawful arrest. And you failed to provide adequate details in your initial statement." Briggs opened his mouth to say something, but the judge didn't give him the chance. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are dismissed." The gavel came, sharp and decisive, like a cold slash. "And I recommend an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs' conduct." The tension in the room was like a rubber band stretched too tight, and then, suddenly, it snapped. Briggs looked as if he'd been punched square in the gut. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. Couldn't say anything. Renee just exhaled, slowly, controlled. She had never doubted the outcome. As she stood up to gather her things, her eyes flicked to Briggs one last time. They looked at each other. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. This time, she wasn't the one fighting for her honor. Briggs was the one doing it. The air in the room was still thick as he stood up, turned, and strode out of the courtroom, his boots clicking loudly on the polished stone floor. The sound echoed, lingering until the door closed. And then, there was silence. His face was tight, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He could feel the eyes on him, drilling into his back like needles. Officers, court staff, even reporters who had caught wind of the case and arrived, their presence a constant reminder of just how much things had changed. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control. Used to walking into a room and commanding respect, or at the very least, fear. But now, the power he had once carried so effortlessly felt like it was slipping through his fingers like sand. And the more he tried to hold on, the faster it drained away. Then came the worst part. Sergeant Briggs. A sharp voice cut through the murmur of the hallway. He turned sharply, his pulse spiking. Chief Eldon Baker stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Briggs had seen that look before, on officers who'd had the weight of the world drop onto their shoulders all at once. But he'd never thought it would be directed at him. Baker had been on the force for over 30 years. Respected. Feared. When he spoke, people listened. His word carried weight. Briggs straightened instinctively, pushing his shoulders back, hoping to regain just a sliver of authority. Baker studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment before giving a curt nod. Then he turned and motioned for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the air shifted. The hum of voices outside faded, leaving behind only silence and the heavy tension between them. When Baker finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, too steady. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled sharply, forcing his expression into something unreadable. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Baker scoffed, tossing a thick file onto the desk between them. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's not what it looks like from here." Briggs' eyes flicked to the file, but he didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside. The body cam footage. The arrest reports. The complaints. The mistakes. Baker let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle before he spoke again. The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting. Briggs' nostrils flared. What does that have to do with anything? Baker leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous. Everything. Briggs swallowed. His jaw was so tight it hurt. This wasn't some random woman, Baker continued. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear? Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. She was disrespectful. She questioned you, Baker cut in, his voice sharp. That's not a crime. Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. You don't get it. People like that. The shift was subtle, but Briggs saw it immediately. The way Baker's face hardened, the way his shoulders tensed. People like what? Briggs hesitated. The words were there, caught in his throat, but something about the way Baker was looking at him made them impossible to say. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead as if this conversation was already exhausting him. When he looked back up, his expression was unreadable once more. The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. Briggs' stomach dropped. You've been flagged for racial profiling. The room suddenly felt smaller. Colder. The weight in his chest grew heavier, pressing against his ribs until he could barely breathe. For the first time in a long time, Sergeant Briggs had no control at all. Briggs felt his stomach twist into a tight knot. What does that mean? His voice was steady, but a cold dread crawled up his spine. Baker straightened his shoulders, his expression unreadable. It means you're being put on immediate suspension. Effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're going to find. He shook his head slowly. Your career is over. The words hit Briggs like a wrecking ball. His breath came short, his pulse pounded in his ears. This is bull. Don't finish that sentence, Baker cut in, his voice like ice. Pack up your desk. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. Briggs stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides, his world unraveling in real time. The office around him blurred, the fluorescent lights suddenly too harsh, the hum of conversation from nearby desks distant and meaningless. He had spent years, decades, building his career, rising through the ranks, playing the game. And now? Now it was crumbling in front of him. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Renee sat in a quiet cafe, her fingers idly stirring her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already made headlines. The footage had gone viral. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. She had known from the second she stepped out of her car that night how this would go. She had seen men like Briggs before, entitled, arrogant, used to bending the law in their favor. But this time, he had lost. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges. Renee took a slow, measured sip of her coffee. A quiet, restrained satisfaction settled in her chest. Good. She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her. People going about their day, oblivious to the battle she had fought, the weight she had carried. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the people Briggs had likely hurt before. But today? Today was a win. She exhaled, the crisp afternoon air carrying the scent of fresh rain as she stepped out of the cafe. The past 24 hours should have weighed her down, but they didn't. Instead, she walked with the same confidence she always had, head high, step steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she recognized. She sighed, then answered. Captain. Lieutenant Commander, the familiar voice greeted her, steady and unreadable. Renee tightened her grip on the phone. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. I guess she saw the news. There was a brief pause, then. So how do you feel? Renee glanced at her reflection in a nearby store window. There was no sign of collapse. There was no crack in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I had to do. The captain's voice softened. I thought she would say that. A pause. The Department of Defense had noticed her case. Don't be surprised if they want her to speak out. Renee exhaled slowly through her nose. I'm not sure I want to be the focus of the media. You are, the captain replied quickly. Whether she liked it or not, what happened to her reflected something much larger. She knew it. She always knew it. Briggs was not an isolated case. He was just part of a system that had allowed people like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe hundreds, of people who had been in her shoes but had no hierarchy, no legal team, no voice to fight back. Renee leaned against a streetlight, watching the cars whiz by. This wasn't the first time this had happened, she said, and it wouldn't be the last. No, the captain agreed. But this was the first time Briggs had suffered. And that was because she hadn't backed down. Renee closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her back. Not when he tried to threaten her. Not when the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. And not when she'd spent that night in jail, knowing the odds were stacked against her. But she persisted. And now, she had won. The captain cleared his throat. There was one more thing, he added. She might get a call from the mayor's office. Renee's eyebrows rose. It seemed. Renee leaned back in her chair, her eyes focused on the screen as the voice on the other end of the line spoke with rare dignity. We would like to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She sneered. Now the irony was there. The recognition came belatedly, a small gift after the battle she had fought all on her own. On the other end of the line, the captain chuckled. Will you accept it? Renee thought for a moment. She didn't need recognition to know her worth. But sometimes, affirmations carried weight. Finally, she shrugged. I'll think about it. She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Taking a deep breath, she looked up at the orange-tinged afternoon sky. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son. The boy's small hand was wrapped tightly around his mother's, his eyes bright, his mouth laughing at something innocent, full of life. Renee watched them for a moment. It was a simple sight, but it resonated deeply with her. The next generation. She was fighting for herself, but she was also fighting for that boy. For all the boys and girls who deserved to grow up in a world where people like Briggs could not use their badges as weapons. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her steps were steady, her purpose clear. This fight had never been hers alone. It had never been about one person, it had been about unchecked power, power abused. And the only way to change the system was to hold it accountable. What happened to Renee is happening to so many people every day, people without the privilege of rank, connections, or evidence to defend themselves. That's why it's so important to speak up. Demand change. Refuse to be silent. If this story makes you think, share it. If it makes you angry, talk about it. And if it makes you realize how much work there is to do, keep getting involved. Because real change starts with real conversations.